I'm joined by a very special guest, the wonderful Simone Herbert-Lowe, a legal expert with over 30 years' experience in insurance, risk management, cyber, and liability law. Simone is the founder of Law and Cyber, where she empowers Australian businesses to enhance their cyber resilience through legal advisory services, cyber incident tabletop exercises, and education. She has successfully educated over 10,000 Australians on cyber risk, authored numerous journal articles, and recently gave evidence to a parliamentary committee on cybercrime. Simone has been recognised with the AGSM's Warrnambool Lee Prize for Ethical Leadership in Business and Innovator of the Year at the Lawyers Weekly Women in Law Awards. I really enjoyed my time with Simone in the studio as we unpacked the existential cyber threats that exist in today's world. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Cyber Voices.
I've been a lawyer for all of my career, and I used to work for the professional indemnity insurer for the legal profession in New South Wales. And so I'd handled around 2,000 professional indemnity notifications over 20 years or so.
Yep.
And I was there, I suppose, at the time that we first started seeing cases of email fraud and cyber events impacting the legal profession. And it really, really struck me that it was a very different kind of risk to what we had seen in the past, which was usually things about, failure to communicate properly or failure to advise. And all of a sudden, there were all these really significant professional implications for the lawyers who were involved in these cases. But it had nothing to do with how good they were as a lawyer or how skilled they were. It was something completely different, but it still was really relevant to their professional duties, like a duty of confidentiality and managing trust accounts and things like that. So I was in the fortunate position of handling some of the first cases that came out, and then through that, speaking to people who were at the coalface, like in terms of the investigations, or at Lloyd's of London on the cyber insurance side. So it was just a really interesting new area of risk. And I guess I could see the potential for it to grow very dramatically. And also when you deal with people face to face like that and you see the devastation that it can cause, I felt very strongly that I wanted to be part of the solution. And so then I ended up setting up my own business to help educate people about this area.
Excellent. Was that one of the first of its kinds, especially in the legal industry? Because I don't know if I've really come across another law and cyber style organisation before.
Yeah, it's it's a boutique kind of legal advisory and a risk advisory, really. And certainly there are other cyber lawyers out there, but it is an unusual. Yeah, I think it is. You're right. It's an unusual mix of education and legal.
Well, because it's so industry specific. So why do you think it is that the legal profession needed something quite tailored to it?
Because lawyers have very strong duties of care, but particularly because they manage trust accounts. And if you are a professional trustee, like a lawyer or a superannuation fund or someone like that, basically it's strict liability if you pay money out in error.
Yeah.
And so if you think about the average property price in Sydney or Melbourne, how much money that is going into a lawyer's trust account, if it's a deposit or the full amount, they're really big, significant losses. But just on that score, it's true that our education started with legal and we've had around 10,000 completions of our course within the legal sector. But since then, we've actually customised the training for different industries and different areas. So, for example, sports, luxury retail, all sorts of things, because every sector has its own particular risk profile according to the kind of information they collect or what they're, what area they're working in.
Well, there's so much commonality, which is probably
there's a lot of commonality.
Yeah.
But if you can tailor it to an industry. See, I have a strong belief that for education to be effective, it needs to have some kind of emotional impact and rather than being a box ticking exercise. So we always have case studies tailored to that industry, for example.
What, in your opinion, makes for a really powerful, impactful cyber education program?
I think humans have always learned through stories.
Yeah.
And so stories that have an emotional impact, or where the person listening to it can go, oh my goodness, that could have been me. And so they actually change their behavior because they've heard of that and they've heard the consequences for it. But there's also 2 or 3 really, I think, hard-hitting facts that I usually always use in my presentations, which is that if cybercrime were a country, it would be the 3rd biggest economy in the world. And you see people's jaws drop when they hit, and you go, that's how bad it is. You can't think this is just some little niche thing. That's not your problem. It's everybody's problem now. So,
do you think people are starting to wake up a little bit more to the fact that, that they will be a target? Because you kind of used to get a lot of people just be like, oh, it's not something that'll happen to me. All right. You kind of help them understand this is a indiscriminate net being cast wide. I mean, sometimes maybe in the legal profession it might be a little bit targeted. But in general, it's a very real risk for everyone, because a lot of people go, well, why do I need to learn this, right? I'm not.
Yeah.
Do you come up across a lot of that?
I think absolutely people are getting more educated for sure, and particularly people in organisations in those kind of roles more, recognise that it's not, if but when kind of thing. But I still think a lot of people don't think like that. I mean, I certainly remember a conversation with a friend of mine who was like, oh, well, I'm never going to be a target because, I've just got this little architectural practice and whatever, and not understanding that you don't have to be a target to be a victim, or that, there's just so many different reasons why you're, unfortunately your information has been breached in some way. And so, so they use it. And then, of course, not that long after, he was scammed, and they took over his computer and things like that. So, I think there's still a long way to go before people realise. I think people know how common it is, but they always assume it'll be someone else. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people think, there's a bit of a philosophy that, someone might have just been a bit stupid or foolish, and they don't necessarily understand that technology has enabled fraud and deception at a level that was never there before, and at a level of sophistication that's just going to get better and, better and better and harder to detect with AI as well.
Yeah. I guess that makes what you're doing even that much more important, because I think those of us who work in this industry, it can still blow our minds when others don't quite get it. And, cybersecurity is a term that everyone knows now. Maybe 5 years ago, it was like, what? What's that? Why do I care? Is there a lot of noise that needs to be cut through, or are people sort of more actively seeking out this education at the moment?
I think people really like to have the education. One thing I will say is that people, it really depends on the roles in an organisation. I think sometimes, for example, we've had times where insurers have licensed our training and give it to free to their members, and thousands of people do it. But when they have to pay for it, they don't. And so I think, there's always going to be roles in companies where people don't want to spend money. Like that might be the chief financial officer or whatever. I'm not trying to tar everyone with the one brush, but you know what I mean? There's people that don't want to spend money on cyber, for example. One of the things
they know they need to do it.
They know they need to, but they might say, oh, we've got this great Chief Information Security Officer, he or she can go and educate everyone, but as if they don't have enough to do already. Yeah.
What's a concept that you think people struggle with a lot? What's one of the hardest messages to get across?
I think, it's just this concept that it's a technology problem and I don't have to think about that. I mean, if we think about some of the really big breaches that we've all heard about over the last few years, they haven't necessarily been a technology problem as such. It's almost like it can be a governance issue, a project management issue.
Yeah.
People don't realise how much it actually, that every business is now a digital business if you use email or have a website or whatever. And so that it is everyone's business in that organisation to protect it, not just the people on the technology team or in a small company.
Everyone's kind of grappling a little bit with this sort of unknown, sort of existential kind of threat when it comes to cybersecurity. Do we pay the ransom? Do we not pay the ransom? Like, this happened over here to them. Could it happen to us too? Yeah, and it's well, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But what does that mean, right? Like, what would we do in those cases? But we've got all these amazing policies, and and whilst there's a lot of people out there who are saying, okay, cool, we now accept the not if but when, they're still looking for as much of a finite statement to go, yeah, but it's probably not going to happen.
That's right.
Yeah, for boards and executives, it's this terrifying unknown concept, and then you've got the ones who've lived through it, who are kind of the heroes that go and tell their story of great survival to others, which is actually really quite powerful too.
Yeah, exactly.
To reflect on those. I want to touch on something which I just mentioned, which was about the existential cyber threat. You and I have had a couple of really good conversations leading into getting into the studio today about exactly this. And now in those conversations, you raised with me an individual named Azim Azar. Now, Azim has got a concept of what he refers to as the exponential gap.
Yeah.
So I'd love if you could. I did a little bit of research on him before I came in, but I get the fact that you're probably quite more clued onto this than I am. So could you maybe introduce myself and our audience to Azim a little bit and explain this whole exponential gap concept and how it matters in what's happening in cybersecurity?
I was fortunate to be given a copy of his book called The Exponential Gap for Christmas, and I started reading it, and it just kind of really made sense to me. Of kind of pulled together a lot of things that I'd seen, but and into a framework that made sense. And what he's basically saying is that technology is accelerating so quickly that but at the same time, all of our societal institutions and laws and regulations are still trundling along at this kind of linear rate. So the gap between where our society is in terms of our norms, of our laws and regulations and things like that, the gap between that and where technology is now is just increasing exponentially. And that just as just one example, when telephones came in, good old landlines, it was 50 years before 75% of phones in America, 75% of people had a phone.
Yeah.
But when they brought in a smartphone, 75 in less than 10 years. And of course, people have the smartphones, now they're banking on that, or they've got social media, and there's all these other things that are being done with phones that have created, obviously, massive convenience and lots of great things, but also a lot of risks as well. And so 10 years, for example, to have such a massive change where we've got kids with phones, elderly people banking on mobile phones, all this kind of stuff, the law is a very slow thing to catch up, and it's just falling further behind. So that's kind of what, not that his book is about the law as such, but that really resonated for me in terms of some of the issues that we see, say, with scams, with people, highly sophisticated scams, and losing their life savings, for example, because online banking doesn't protect them in the way that going to a branch used to.
Right, yeah, it's quite amazing when you think about it like that. Even that reference to smartphones. I was listening to another podcast this morning where it was an actor who was referring to the fact that, we just, my phone's sitting right here on the desk. Like, we live our whole lives through it. And, you messaged me just before we got into the studio to just let me know your phone was almost dying, and you got in here and, oh my God, you were looking for a PowerPoint.
Exactly.
Like, heaven help you if this thing was this little portal to your world.
I know. And you needed to contact me, but you couldn't, and you didn't know if I was going to make it or not. So.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we're used to being quite reachable now in a number of different ways.
Yeah,
and
that's
that's a whole existentialism in all in itself. But so this sounds like it's this concept of, all right, so what did he refer to it as? The exponential gap. That's the name of the book, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So it's basically saying that, well, so technology has the conveniences of technology are advancing so fast. And I almost take from it, well, we're so intent on making our lives better through technology that we're not considering the risks of if we should, or what this introduction could do. I mean, you look at social media.
Yes.
And what is that? What's that done to the media landscape and
Yeah.
the way people consume news. I was on a train the other week after the US election listening to two teenage girls talk about, well, I heard on TikTok that Kamala Harris did this, and I heard on TikTok, same thing. I heard on TikTok that Donald Trump did that, and I was like, wow. And here's me criticizing people who get their news through certain commercial media outlets, but this is what's happening these days, and now we've got social media bans, which is a whole nother podcast topic all in itself, to try and protect youth. But is it protecting youth? And it's really quite crazy. So how does the rapid pace of technological change, like how do protections keep up with this?
I think we have to. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I think particularly in the law as well, we're going to have to come up with much more flexible and agile concepts than we've had. Like in the past, if you want law reform to deal with something, you have to have a law in place, and then somebody's got to have a problem with it and it doesn't work, and then somebody's got to advocate for legal change, and then someone's got to convince their parliamentarians to vote for that and whatever. And so this process is something that takes a really long time.
Yeah.
And yet, that might take 10 years after something went wrong in the first place. Like that's just way too long. So we're going to have kind of more, I think, kind of big picture kind of laws rather than really, really specific ones. So one thing that I've really noticed is how terms and conditions, for example, that nobody ever reads are written in a way that basically pass all the liability and risk on to a consumer rather than a big tech company or a financial institution that is actually much, much better placed to actually manage that risk, but they can sort of pass it on legally like that. So, for example, if we have laws that kind of prevent that kind of thing at a big picture level, that kind of thing, but there's a lot of work to do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That almost makes it sound like no one's taking responsibility.
Well, I think that's right. Yeah. Well, here's one example. There was that breach of 23andMe, which was, I think, a genetic kind of testing organisation. And so people shared, they basically got, the DNA for millions of people. And of course, that kind of shares information about their relatives as well. But now that companies, that they had a cyber breach, a serious cyber breach, they're basically going into liquidation or whatever. So is the liquidator just going to sell all that information to somebody? I don't think people ever stop to think, they go, oh, this is a really cool thing. I, work out where my ancestors came from and all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
But now someone's got all this information about you and you have no control over it.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's this existential threat that no one really understands that came about through just what was probably a really novel idea to help people track down family trees. I've had discussions with people about some of the other providers in this space as to that would be interesting to find out. And then someone even told me, well, through the terms and conditions that they almost own your DNA because it's like data.
Yeah.
So your DNA is essentially now your personal data, and your DNA is if you want to talk about something that's your identity, that's that.
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
But what does that even mean? And I'm not expecting that you would have the answer to that, but it's something that is quite mind-blowing. I mean, I am a huge sci-fi buff, right? So I'm like, okay, someone has my DNA, they own that DNA, and then cloning becomes a real thing. And then I'm going real out there with the theories right now. But there's quite a few. Imagine
how many podcasts.
Exactly. Imagine how many podcasts I could run. I could use the help. Please email us at cybervoices@ace. No, and that's just one example.
It's just one example of, but that breach supposedly came about just, they were able to, the threat actors were able to get in through, a compromised password, and then the company blames users because they had a weak password. But it's like, well, if you know anything about cybersecurity, you know that passwords get cracked very easily these days. Yeah. So if you don't have something better than that as a company, it's not really good enough. But if you have the terms and conditions, it's like, oh, it's all up to you as the consumer.
Yeah.
they're not accepting responsibility for their role in protecting people.
You touched a little bit then on sort of consumer responsibility there, which I found really interesting, and the institutional power. What do tech and financial companies, they when they're pushing that cybersecurity responsibility onto users, how are they doing it? Is it just through those terms and conditions, or what power can consumers have in this space to kind of take back control of this responsibility? Like, where's the moral high ground here?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, terms and conditions, like even lawyers wouldn't read them a lot of the time in the sense of the everyday life of I want to accept the terms and conditions of this thing, or I can't buy something.
They're open to interpretation, right?
Once upon a time you went to your office and you worked, and then you went home and you left all that stuff behind, whereas now technology is at your fingertips the whole time, and nobody is perfect 24/7 and vigilant 24/7. But not only that, there are people who are more vulnerable as well. Older people, not everybody, there are people who are vulnerable for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. And so I don't think it's fair or ethical to just say, well, that's their own fault because they can't help it. Yeah. The other thing is there's a professor called Professor Monica Wishy who talks about the human aspects of cyber risk and technology risk, and she has this expression that humans are the last line of defense when technology fails us. Yep. So, which is, I think, often you hear, especially when you go to cyber conferences, it's like, oh, humans are the weakest link, which makes, I prefer her take on it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, you can design technology to be safer, but it's a bit tricky, for example, with banking. If people want to bank at a branch, but the branches have been closed and all you've got is the electronic banking, you don't really have a lot of choice. Yeah.
And that's something I think that is being grappled with a little bit in this country at the moment is where do the banks need to, or financial institutions or the retailers need to take a little bit more responsibility here? And it's not even just vulnerable people. Like I've got an example of someone I know a few years ago who fell for a scam text message that said your Netflix payment information needs to be updated. And she had recently updated her credit card because her expiry details had changed. And she clicked the link and provided the new information. And within a few hours, someone had managed to load her card onto a Samsung Pay and went on a little spending spree here in Melbourne. Right. Right? Yeah. This is not something that's coming from somewhere else. No. It's happened right here. Yeah. And because it happened right here, they were able to get away with it too. Because it's not like, the Falcon systems would have kicked in and like what happened to me when I was in Paris and all of a sudden my credit card got blocked because someone was spending $2,000 at Walmart. So there's new bills being introduced. We've got the cybersecurity bill 2024, which I believe you recently had a bit of experience with that. You were asked to give testimony at Parliament House, I believe, based on your response to the consultation for this.
So there's a couple of different parliamentary committees dealing with either the cybersecurity bill or law enforcement. Yeah. So, I was invited. It was a real honour. I was invited to make a submission to the Parliament on law enforcement's ability to respond to cybercrime. So I put in a submission for that, and then they invited me to give evidence, which I did, and it was just an amazing experience. Actually, I was, to be honest, nervous and a bit reluctant before because I had a feeling that anything to do with Parliament would be like the parties trying to have a crack at each other and you'd be in the middle, and it wasn't like that at all. They were genuinely. Because I sat there while, waiting my turn while various other people were giving evidence before me. And you could see that they were genuinely very interested to hear what experts in different fields what their experience was and to ask questions. And so that was really interesting, and I'll be interested to see what recommendations they give at the end of that. What I was asked about was more about education what is the role of education in because basically what my submission argued was that if cybercrime is if it was a country, it'd be the third biggest economy in the world. So you're never going to have enough law enforcement resources.
Yep.
So you have to look at prevention rather than just enforcement to solve this problem. And so that was about having meaningful and effective education across the community, having banks and technology. So, that financial institutions had a bigger role to play in protecting customers. And then also on the technology side, that people couldn't basically transfer all their risk back to consumers. So that was what my evidence was about.
What are some of the practical strategies you think that we can implement to help, society keep pace with these technological advancements? Government, individuals, consumers, banks playing together to help us, close this exponential gap, or can we even do it? Is it too far out of our hands?
I don't think it's too far out of our hands, but it does take commitment.
Yeah,
and I think especially the leaders of organisations, and so there's so much that organisations can do to make their own organisation cyber resilient, but also to protect their customers. So we talk a lot about ESG and, all the good things, the corporate social responsibility. So I think that increasingly companies with commitment to social responsibility won't just try and pass on risks to their customers. They will try and protect their customers from risks. They will not collect data that they don't need.
Yep.
And they, will do what they can to protect customers. And it also means within organisations accepting that it's a whole of business risk, not just something that belongs to the technology team who gets in trouble if something goes wrong, but also all the kind of, work that we do, for example, around education, executive training so that execs understand their role, and how much information governance or decisions about data are made across all parts of a business. And then also, the cyber incident tabletops or simulations where you role play how you would respond to a cyber incident means that you're going to get that muscle memory and a much better outcome if you actually, if and when it does happen, than if you're just kind of learning on the spot in panic mode, which is never the ideal situation.
Here's an intensely philosophical conversation question for you. I don't know if
well, I hope I'm not too
I don't know if philosophy. I don't know if you ask.
Don't take
this the wrong way, but I don't know if you ask lawyers philosophical questions. But what's the utopia in this space? Like, I often think, what would I be doing if these risks and these threats didn't exist?
Yeah.
I love what I do for work because it's so interesting and there's always something new to learn, but there's also very real and awful life-destroying consequences behind it as well.
That's a tough one because, as long as there's always, unfortunately, in the human race, you're always going to have some bad eggs.
Yeah.
You've got lots of great people, but there'll be people that want to make money in an easy way, and people will be a target. So we need to have systems in place that protect people. We can't just say it's up to the individual to protect themselves all the time when we can have deep fake videos. You would have seen the story about somebody that was convinced to pay $25 million out of a corporate bank account because of a deep fake, right? So I think the utopia is that
people stop being awful.
People stop being awful. But that we see it as a society-wide issue and that we want to protect everybody instead of saying it's all that person's fault. And we will just have much better outcomes across the board if we all look after the collective and not just say every single person, because it's not possible.
Yep. And there it is. You got there in the end.
Took a while.
No, I love where you got to with that. It's because it's the blame game.
Yeah.
Like I often think about how I feel a little bit more secure in my employment these days, because once upon a time, people in jobs like mine, when there was a breach, generally were let go, or, went looking for other opportunities,
right.
is what you would read in the media
Yeah.
once the mess was. But we've become, there's a lot less blame being placed in that space, but there's still a lot of being, in general, there's a lot of blame. The public lays blame, the government lays blame, like the organizations themselves who are impacted lay blame. And that's where, true shared accountability comes into it.
Yeah, and especially for leaders as well, because at the end of the day, the board of an organization is responsible for its governance, right? And so that is a really a big growth area, and I think boards are really sort of waking up to that as well. But you can't just say it's this employee's problem. Was there a governance?
Mm-hmm.
Was there proper information governance or whatever? Were proper questions asked?
Yeah, look, I mentioned before I'm really into sci-fi, and I still believe that maybe the utopian Star Trek future is still something that we can maybe get to. Who knows? Simone, it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down and get to have a real proper chat with you and get to know a little bit more about you. So thank you so much for sharing your voice with us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Grateful for the opportunity, and as you say, it's just really nice to actually, have a good chat about it. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Cyber Voices. Our music is by Sanar Garut, our show artwork is by Studio Quarantine, and we record our show at This Is a Studio in Pran, Melbourne, part of Popplant Productions. Please make sure you follow the show on your podcast platform of choice and leave us a 5-star review. This will help others find the show. Also, please follow the association on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you want to add your voice to our ever-growing chorus of diverse cyber voices, have questions, feedback, or would like to be a sponsor, you can do so by emailing us at cybervoices@aisa.org.au. That's cybervoices@aisa.org.au. Are you an ASA member? If not, you should consider joining our network of over 12,000 members across Australia. An ASA membership can open doors, build professional networks, create lifetime friendships, and offer exclusive training, events, and other perks. Become a member today by heading to our website at asa.org.au. That is all for today. I hope you will join us again next time on Cyber Voices.